Welcome to another deep dive, everybody. Today, we are going to be tackling Chapter 4 of Building Thinking Classrooms in Mathematics. And let me tell you, this one is all about arranging furniture
Yes.
to encourage deeper thinking in math.
Absolutely.
It's amazing how, the setup of a room can totally change the vibe,
Oh,
right?
totally. Think about it like a formal dinner party
Right.
versus a casual game night. I mean, the arrangement instantly tells you how to behave.
Totally. Yeah. And it's the same for students.
It's the same for our students.
Okay, so Chapter 4 dives into how the arrangement of our classroom sends a powerful message
Yes.
to students about what kind of thinking is valued. It's like the furniture speaking to them.
Exactly. And even when teachers think desks are placed randomly,
Right.
the chapter highlights how students consistently pick up on an underlying message. They see straight lines, orderliness, and it subtly influences their expectations about how math should be approached.
So if the furniture is already talking, we might as well make it say something interesting.
Yes.
So what's fascinating here is this concept of defronting the classroom.
Yes.
Now, I have to admit, when I first heard that term, I pictured just moving the teacher's desk to the side. But it's so much more than that, isn't it?
It really is. Defronting is about breaking away from that traditional front-facing setup that can actually limit student interaction and collaboration. You're shifting the focus away from the teacher as the sole source of knowledge and creating a space where students can engage with each other more directly.
Okay, so defronting is like the big, bold move.
Yes.
But Chapter 4 also talks about these micro moves, and these are the little tweaks. That can make a huge difference in how the classroom feels. It's almost like you're choreographing the flow of thinking, right?
Exactly. Think about clustering desks away from walls, positioning them so chairs face different directions. By simply changing the angles and the flow of movement, you're encouraging interaction and a more dynamic learning experience.
And this really challenges the idea that neat and tidy equals good learning. There's a part in the chapter that talks about how super organized spaces might seem ideal, but they actually make students less likely to take risks in their thinking.
It's so counterintuitive, isn't it? But the research is clear. A little bit of disorder can actually be a good thing. Now, this doesn't mean letting your classroom descend into chaos, but it does mean reconsidering our obsession with perfectly aligned rows and sterile surfaces.
So it's about striking that balance between structure and freedom.
Yes.
And this chapter has this great line about how productive disorder can create a space that feels more inviting and conducive to exploration.
Right.
I've been in classrooms that feel so rigid.
Yes.
It's almost like they're telling you, don't even think about making a mistake here.
Yes. And think about the message that sends, especially in a subject like math, where taking risks and making mistakes is such an essential part of the learning process.
It's like we're subconsciously telling students that math is all about precision and getting the right answer rather than a process of exploration and discovery.
Exactly. And by simply rearranging the furniture, we can start to shift that message.
Yeah.
It's a subtle but powerful change.
Yeah, I know some of our listeners might be thinking,
Yeah.
okay, this all sounds great in theory, but what about the practical side of things?
Right.
And Chapter 4 actually addresses some common challenges
Yes.
that teachers might face. Like, what about those of us who share a classroom? Rearranging furniture multiple times a day might not be feasible.
Right. And the chapter offers a fantastic solution for that. Creating small maps of different desk arrangements that students can quickly reference. This way, transitions between classes can be smoother and more efficient, and students can even take ownership with the setup process.
What a great way to make it feel less chaotic and more like a collaborative effort. The chapter also addresses fixed furniture because not all of us have the luxury of movable desks and tables.
Absolutely. And in those cases, the chapter encourages teachers to think outside the box and use the existing space to encourage interaction. For example, you might have students cluster around shared tables, even if those tables are bolted to the floor. It's about getting creative with the arrangement within the constraints you have.
It's about working with the space, not against it.
Yeah.
And the chapter also dives into managing different group sizes.
Yes.
Because that can be a real headache.
Definitely. And the recommendation is to have a variety of table sizes available so that you can easily reconfigure the room for different activities. Small tables for individual or small group work, larger tables for collaborative projects or whole class discussions. Having that flexibility is key.
It's all about intentionality, right? Making thoughtful choices about how we arrange our space to support the type of thinking we want to encourage.
Exactly. It's like we're saying to our students, this is a place where your thinking is valued, and we've created a space to help you do your best thinking.
It's like we're setting the stage for deeper learning. Speaking of setting the stage, let's talk about those vertical surfaces, the whiteboards. The bulletin boards, those are impossible to ignore.
They are. And the chapter actually suggests clustering desks and tables away from those vertical surfaces. The idea is to reduce that constant pull towards the front of the room and encourage students to interact more with each other and with the learning materials at their tables.
So instead of being passively bombarded with information from the front, they're more actively engaged with the learning process.
Right.
I'm starting to see how all these small tweaks can add up to a big shift in the overall learning experience.
It's a holistic approach, really. It's about recognizing that the physical environment plays a crucial role in shaping the learning process and using that to our advantage.
It's like we're not just teachers, we're also architects of thinking. But before we get too carried away with rearranging furniture, I'm curious to hear more about your personal takeaways from this chapter. What really resonated with you?
For me, it was the emphasis on observation. The chapter talks about how teachers can learn so much by simply paying attention to how their students interact with the space and with each other. Their behavior can give us valuable insights into what's working and what might need to be adjusted.
It's like we're all classroom detectives gathering clues.
Yeah.
I love that. So you're
Yeah.
saying we should be paying attention to how students move around the room, how they group themselves, how they interact with different learning materials.
Absolutely. And those observations can inform our decisions about how we arrange the furniture, how we structure activities, and even how we facilitate discussions. It's about being responsive to the needs of our students and creating a space that truly supports their thinking.
I'm starting to think of classroom arrangement as less about finding the perfect setup and more about an ongoing process of experimentation and refinement,
Yes.
just like the learning process itself.
Exactly. And it's about embracing the messiness of that process. This chapter reminds us that learning is not always linear and predictable. It can be messy, it can be chaotic, and that's okay. In fact, it's often in those moments of productive disorder that the most meaningful learning occurs.
That's a powerful thought, that our classrooms should reflect the messy beauty of the learning process.
It's about creating a space that feels alive with thinking, a space that encourages exploration, collaboration, and risk-taking.
And a space that celebrates the unique ways each student learns and thinks.
Beautifully said. It's about shifting the focus from uniformity to individuality, from compliance to creativity, from passivity to active engagement.
It's about creating a space where students feel empowered to take ownership of their learning and where their voices can be heard.
And to help them understand that math isn't just about memorizing formulas or finding the right answer. It's about using your mind to solve problems, to explore patterns, to make connections, to think creatively.
And that's a message worth sending, don't you think?
Absolutely. And who knows, maybe by simply rearranging our furniture, we can even inspire the next generation of mathematicians.
I love that idea. And speaking of inspiration, the chapter also includes some intriguing math problems that seem to be designed to encourage the very kind of thinking we've been talking about. Should we take a look at those?
Let's dive in. One that caught my eye was the jelly beans activity, and it's perfect for K through 2 students. It's such a playful way to introduce them to problem solving.
Oh yeah, I remember that one. It involves jars and, of course, jelly beans, right? It challenges those young minds to think about different ways to arrange and group them.
Precisely. The activity instructs teachers to place 16 jelly beans in 4 jars, then asks students to figure out how many ways they can arrange them so that each jar has either 3 or 6 jelly beans.
So it seems simple at first glance, but there's this sneaky complexity there that encourages them to explore different possibilities and realize there's not just one right way to arrange things.
Exactly. Just like there's not just one right way to arrange a thinking classroom. It beautifully reinforces the chapter's themes.
I love how those connections emerge. It shows how these seemingly simple activities can have a much deeper purpose when it comes to shaping the learning environment.
Okay, what about an example for older students?
Well, for grades 9 through 12, the gold chain problem is a real gem.
Oh, yes. That one sounds like a brain teaser. It involves a traveler, a 50-link gold chain, and a hotel manager who's a bit particular about payment right.
You got it. The traveler's backpacking through Europe runs out of money and has to pay for their hotel with links from this gold chain.
1 link per night makes sense. But here's the catch. The hotel manager only accepts payment in lengths of 4 links and gives change in single links. The challenge is to figure out how many gold links the traveler has left at the end of their trip.
It's a fantastic example of a problem that requires strategic thinking and pattern recognition. Students can't just dive in. They have to consider the constraints, plan their moves, and visualize the process of breaking down the chain and receiving change. The chapter even offers a helpful hint. Think about how the value of the gold changes with each transaction. If you pay with 4 links and receive 2 single links as change, you've essentially traded 4 for 2.
It's a nudge in the right direction, encouraging them to analyze the problem step by step without giving away the solution. These types of problems can really spark lively discussions and collaborative problem solving in the classroom.
Speaking of lively discussions, this chapter also got me thinking about my own teaching habits. I realized how much I default to standing at the front of the room. It's like an unconscious habit ingrained from years of traditional classroom setups.
It's a common pattern for sure, but this chapter really pushes us to break free from that, to move around the room more, and to be mindful of how our physical presence impacts the learning dynamics.
It's almost like we're physically breaking down those invisible barriers that can exist between the teacher zone and the student zone.
Exactly. The chapter suggests that by positioning ourselves in different spots, we encourage students to direct their attention to different parts of the room, fostering a more dynamic and inclusive learning environment.
Instead of all eyes on the teacher at the front, the attention shifts to the learning happening all around the room. It creates a sense of shared space and encourages students to see themselves as active participants rather than passive recipients of knowledge.
That's the goal. But we also have to acknowledge that rearranging furniture isn't a magic bullet. There are real-world challenges teachers face, and this chapter doesn't shy away from those.
You're talking about the Q&A section, right? It's packed with practical advice for teachers who might be feeling a little overwhelmed by the idea of a complete classroom overhaul.
Precisely. For example, it acknowledges that not all teachers have the luxury of movable desks and tables.
Right, fixed furniture can be a real constraint. But the chapter encourages teachers to think about how they can use the existing space creatively to encourage interaction and collaboration.
Exactly. It's about making the most of what you have. Even if you can't move the furniture, you can still think about how you arrange students within that fixed space. You could cluster them around shared tables, create designated areas for different activities, or use flexible seating options like floor cushions or beanbag chairs to create a more relaxed and inviting atmosphere.
It's all about adaptability and making those small tweaks that can make a big difference. I remember one teacher in the book who had a classroom with fixed tables, and she found that simply by changing the direction students were facing, having them turn to face each other instead of the front of the room, she saw a dramatic increase in student interaction.
It's amazing how such a small shift can have such a powerful impact. And what about the challenge of managing different group sizes? That's something I often struggle with.
Me too. It can be tough to constantly rearrange the furniture to accommodate individual work, small group collaborations, and whole class discussions. But the chapter offers a great tip. Having a variety of table sizes available so you can easily reconfigure the room for different activities.
That's so smart. You could have smaller tables for individual or paired work, medium-sized tables for groups of 4 or 5, and then larger tables that you could push together for whole class activities.
It's like having a modular classroom ready to be adapted to any learning scenario.
And it reinforces the idea that the classroom is a dynamic space that can evolve to meet the needs of the learners and the learning activities.
This chapter also made me realize how much I rely on vertical surfaces, whiteboards, bulletin boards, as the focal point of my classroom. It's like they're magnets for attention.
It's true, we tend to gravitate towards those surfaces, but the chapter suggests clustering desks and tables away from them, which seems counterintuitive at first.
Right, but the idea is that by reducing the visual dominance of those vertical surfaces, we're encouraging students to interact more with each other and with the learning materials at their tables.
It shifts the focus from passive absorption of information to active engagement and collaboration.
Instead of being anchored to the front of the room, students are free to move around, to explore, to discuss, to create. It's a much more dynamic learning environment.
And it helps to break down that traditional hierarchy where the teacher is the sage on the stage and the students are passive recipients of knowledge.
It's about creating a more equitable learning environment where everyone's voice can be heard and where everyone has the opportunity to contribute.
This chapter has me rethinking everything from the placement of my desks to the way I use my whiteboard. I'm seeing my classroom with fresh eyes, like a blank canvas waiting to be transformed.
Me too. It's like we've been given a secret decoder ring for understanding the language of our classrooms and how even the smallest details can send powerful messages about what kind of learning we value.
And it's not just about the messages we're sending to our students, it's also about the messages we're sending to ourselves.
What do you mean by that?
Well, think about it. When we create a classroom that's flexible, inviting, and conducive to collaboration, we're also sending ourselves the message that we're open to new ideas, that we value student voice, and that we're willing to let go of control and embrace the messiness of the learning process.
That's a beautiful thought. It's like we're creating a space that reflects our own values and beliefs about learning.
Exactly. And those values and beliefs will inevitably shape the learning experiences of our students.
This chapter has me thinking about all sorts of possibilities for my own classroom.
Me too. I'm already starting to envision a space that's more dynamic, more engaging, and more reflective of the kind of learning I want to foster.
But before we get too carried away with our classroom makeover plans, I want to touch on one more important point from the chapter, the concept of productive disorder. It seems like this idea runs counter to everything we've been taught about classroom management.
It does, doesn't it? We're conditioned to believe that a well-managed classroom is a tidy classroom with everything in its place. But this chapter challenges that notion. It suggests that a little bit of visual noise can actually be a good thing.
I remember reading about that study where students were actually less likely to generate creative ideas in perfectly organized classrooms. It's like our brains need a little bit of stimulation, a little bit of visual chaos to spark those creative juices.
It makes sense when you think about it. Learning itself is messy and unpredictable. We're constantly making connections, revising our understanding, and exploring new ideas.
So a few stray pencils on a table or a slightly askew chair might not be such a bad thing after all.
Exactly. It could actually be a sign of a classroom that's alive with thinking. It's about creating a space that feels inviting and conducive to exploration, rather than one that feels sterile and restrictive.
It's like we're giving our students permission to be messy, to make mistakes, to try things out and see what happens.
And that's where the real learning happens. It's in those moments of exploration, experimentation, and even failure that we learn the most.
This chapter really challenges us to rethink our assumptions about what a good classroom looks and feels like. It's not about achieving some unattainable ideal of perfect order. It's about creating a space that reflects the dynamic, messy, and ultimately beautiful process of learning.
I couldn't agree more. It's about shifting our focus from control to empowerment, from uniformity to individuality, from passivity to active engagement.
And that's a shift worth making, don't you think?
Absolutely. And it all circles back to that core message from chapter 4. You know, the way we arrange our physical space sends a powerful message about what kind of thinking we value.
Yeah, it's like we're subliminally shaping the learning experience with every chair placement and bookshelf arrangement, you know? I never thought about it that deeply before.
It's easy to overlook those subtle influences, but they're constantly at play. And as teachers, we have this incredible opportunity to be intentional about the messages we're sending, to create an environment that truly nurtures and encourages thinking.
This deep dive has given me a whole new perspective on something I honestly thought I already had a pretty good handle on. I'm curious, what part of this chapter surprised you the most?
For me, it was the research on how super organized spaces can actually hinder risk-taking in students. It's so counterintuitive, but it makes you realize how much we might be limiting our students without even realizing it.
Right. It's almost like we're saying everything has its place and so do you. But learning isn't about staying neatly within the lines, is it?
Not at all. Learning is about pushing boundaries, making connections, and embracing the messiness of discovery. And sometimes that means allowing for a little productive disorder in our classrooms.
I love that phrase, productive disorder. It's like giving ourselves permission to loosen up a bit, to let go of that need for absolute control, and create a space where students feel safe to experiment, to make mistakes, and to learn from those mistakes.
It's about fostering a growth mindset, not just in our students, but in ourselves as teachers. We have to be willing to take risks, to try new things, and to model that kind of flexible thinking for our students.
This chapter has definitely inspired me to rethink my classroom setup. I'm already picturing a more dynamic and collaborative space where students feel empowered to share their ideas and take ownership of their learning.
That's fantastic. And remember, it's not about achieving some perfect ideal. It's an ongoing process of experimentation and refinement. You'll try things, observe how your students respond, and adjust accordingly. What works for one classroom might not work for another, and that's okay.
Yeah, it's about finding what fits your teaching style, the needs of your students, and the unique dynamics of your classroom. But I think the key takeaway here is that we have so much more agency than we realize when it comes to shaping the learning environment.
Absolutely. We often think of our classrooms as fixed spaces, but they can be so much more than that. They can be dynamic, evolving spaces that reflect the energy and creativity of the learning happening within them.
So for our listeners who are ready to roll up their sleeves and start rearranging furniture, what's the most important piece of advice we can leave them with?
I would say start by observing. Pay attention to how your students interact with the space, how they move around the room, how they group themselves, how they respond to different seating arrangements. Their behavior will give you valuable clues about what's working and what might need to be adjusted.
It's about being mindful and intentional with every choice we make, from the placement of our desks to the way we use our walls.
Mm.
Every element of our classroom sends a message. So let's make sure it's a message that encourages thinking, collaboration, and the love of learning.
Beautifully said. And remember, as Chapter 4 so eloquently reminds us, creating a thinking classroom is an ongoing journey. It's about constantly learning, adapting, and evolving our spaces to better support the needs of our students.
This chapter has left me with one final thought-provoking question for our listeners. If we accept that even the placement of a chair can subtly influence a student's thinking, what other seemingly insignificant classroom elements might be sending unintended messages? Take a look around your own space and see what you discover. You might be surprised by what you find.
And above all, have fun with it. Rearranging furniture, experimenting with new layouts should be an enjoyable process. Embrace the creativity and the opportunity to create a space that truly reflects your passion for teaching and your belief in the power of student thinking.
Wonderful advice. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Chapter 4. We hope you've gained some valuable insights and are feeling inspired to rethink your own classroom spaces. Until next time, keep thinking, keep exploring, and keep creating those amazing thinking classrooms.